Hi everyone and welcome to the Sisu Sisters podcast.
I'm Annukka, a LinkedIn coach.
And I'm Dorita, a business English coach.
Our podcast is all about succeeding with themes like life stories and life out moments. Hi everyone and welcome to a new episode of Sisu Sisters podcast. I'm Annukka.
And I'm Dorita. And today in the studio, or as our guest, we have author Mairi Kidd. Welcome, Mairi.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Mairi, please tell us more about who you are and what you do and how did you become an author?
Certainly. I should say that I am a part-time author, although I think writers write all the time and are thinking about their books all the time. Not very many writers in the world can make a living full-time from their writing. And I have a day job. I'm very lucky. I have a day job at the Saltire Society. I live here in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and the Saltire Society, among other things, delivers Scotland's National Book Awards. So I work there as the director, and I've also worked as the head of literature at Creative Scotland, which is Scotland's National Arts Council, and also I have been a publisher. So by hook or by crook, I work with books, and I've always worked with books or with stories. I'm passionate about storytelling as an oral art form and also about storytelling through other media. So I have had brief spells where I've been lucky enough to work in broadcast and other exciting storytelling roles, sometimes for children and young people and sometimes for adults. And I mostly write for adults. I do occasionally write for children and young people, but I mostly write for adults, and I mostly write about women. Stories about women in history, in fiction and non-fiction. And I started to do that, I think, because I've got a big passion for unheard voices. And as soon as we look back in history, we discover that we only really know the stories of a certain kind of group of people. And so that's my big passion. I've got a couple of books to wave. This is a book that was part of a really lovely project, actually. The book is called We Are All Witches, but the project was called Heel and Harrow. And I was commissioned by two amazing traditional musicians, Rachel Newton and Laura McCall, to write 10 stories about Scotland's witches. And then they made an album responding to the story. So it was so exciting. And I wrote it up into a whole book. And then another book here of the same kind. Well, this one's fictional stories inspired by real women. This one is sort of little biographical sketches of women's lives, and it's called Warriors and Witches and Damn Rebel Bitches. So that maybe gives you an idea, a taste of some of the ways that I quite like having fun as well with books. And then my most recent book is a very serious novel on the totally flip side. It's called The Specimens, and it's about the Birkenhead murders told through the women. And here's Dorita's copy too. Dorita joined me at the launch for this book at Dawn's in London in Marylebone, which was wonderful.
Yes, I do. We do chase our guests even to their book launches.
Yes, we do.
So yes, thank you for that. That was brilliant. That was a nice little sort of synopsis. So, and we got to some of the bits that really interest us, both me and Annukka, is this, like you talking about the voice of the women and writing about women in history. Why is that very important to you? Where did that all come from?
I think I was very lucky when I was young, and indeed still am lucky, that I'm the child of two history teachers. And my dad didn't stay as a history teacher. He went off and did other things, but my mum was a history teacher all of her career. And they were both really passionate about not just telling the big bones of history, the battles and the politics, because all they ever give you much insight into is a certain sort of part of society. And that's very rarely women, and it's very rarely the ordinary people like us who just went about their daily lives. You get this, you get obviously lots of royals, you get lots of politicians, lots and lots and lots and lots of men. And interestingly, very subtly, the fact that we focus on those people can actually really skew our understandings of something. So, for example, I became really interested many years ago in the idea that what we know about women's history in terms of childbirth and so forth may not be as correct as we think it is, because noble women lived very different lives to the ordinary women, who might have been potentially physically fitter because they were working out in the fields. They may have had different nutrition, for better or for worse. They may have had very different experiences because in the early development of medicine, actually, in terms of childbirth, if everything went well, the last thing you wanted was medicine. The last thing you wanted was medical treatment, because, of course, before understanding of antisepsis, that was the point at which actually many of the women who died, say in the Victorian era, that was what they died of, not childbirth, but the medical care that came with it. And so there's just so much we don't know. And we can often look at women's stories from the outside. So, for example, the accounts in Scotland of the witch trials fascinate me, but we don't get the women's stories. So in a way, one of the things that interests me is using fiction to kind of dig below that level and to try to find some insight into the people, because all of these people were people too, but you wouldn't really know it from the pages of, I suppose, a classic history book. And so that's very much a motivation for me, giving voice in a way to the voiceless. And in some ways, I know this sounds very simplistic, but I think it's important for women's confidence and self-knowledge to know that we are part of a very long tradition. We have always been here. We have always been around half of the world. And I kind of believe very much in uplifting women and helping women have that confidence that allows them to have their voice heard today too.
Brilliant. That was very uplifting.
It was.
So you said about, obviously, you writing fiction, but when it's a historical novel like The Specimen, which I have read, which is about, just telling the listeners about serial killers in the 1820s, correct me, 1820s, yes. And it's actually it's telling the story from the female's point of view. You still would have had to, although the females might be fictional, you've still had to do a lot of research. I mean, we had a conversation, me and Annukka, once, and we said about that we feel that would be the worst book, the most difficult book to write would be something with an historical aspect, because you would be so worried about the accuracy. So how do you deal with that? Where do you get your research? What do you do?
I think the first thing I would say is I would be very honest and say that the history that I have written about is relatively well documented. As you say, Dorita, and that doesn't mean that the elements of it that I want to explore are well documented, but the bones are well documented. So I've written about the witch trials in Scotland. That's an area which is not well researched, but there is research. So often I'm not using primary sources. And I don't need to establish the facts beyond. Often I don't need to establish facts beyond facts that are already, as it were, researchers have already written. So very often I'm using secondary research. I'm also quite often, I do go to primary sources. I've been so lucky in how much has been digitized by libraries all over the world. So, and not just libraries. For example, when I was working on the specimens, I was using the Wellcome Collection's historic midwifery texts. So I write about a midwifery text in the book, and I write about a delivery. And it is entirely based on an original welcome collection holding, which is fully digitized, so you can read it from page to page to page. So often then I'm looking for the spaces in the middle and the ways that I can find a fiction and weave a fiction. And that could be taking bald facts of something someone did and then imagining around that what their motivations were, what was going through their heads, what their emotions are. Sometimes I'm totally fictionalizing. And one of the, again, maybe a thing I should say, to be honest, is that something I think I probably do is things that interest me. I'm always squirreling facts away. So I live in Portobello, which is Edinburgh's seaside, and all up and down the coast here, and particularly not actually very, very close to where I live, there was salt panning. And these wonderful women put salt on their backs and they tramped miles and miles selling their salt. And we have a road that goes into the centre of Edinburgh city, and it's called Fishwives Causeway, because as well as the salt wives, of course, the fishwives were putting their creels on their back. Now, I'm fascinated by that history, and so I've just squirreled it away. And then when I needed to write about a victim of the Birkenhead killings, who was a salt wife, I've already got all of that squirreled away. And so one of the wonderful things I think about writing is that you don't have to follow a linear path. You need to kind of build your own little store of all the things that interest you. And one day they will come back. A brilliant book that I really love is by Annabel Abbs, and it's about the cookbook author Eliza Acton. And Annabel Abbs told me that she'd written that years and years and years ago, and then sort of put it away. And then when COVID struck, all of the fascination with cooking and the history of cooking, because people were at home and wanting to kind of make their homes real sanctuaries, they became so much more interested. And suddenly that book had a new life, and she got it out and she reworked it and it was published. So always ideas and pieces of work can be kept and returned to. And I also, honestly, I've watched all the I've read all Jane Austen and the Brontes and many other authors, and I've watched every single adaptation ever made of a Jane Austen or a Bronte. And I could, if you wanted to buy a ticket for me at the Festival Fringe in Edinburgh, I think I could do every character in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. And so some of that you just absorb. That's how that time period works. These are the words that writers were using at the time. Those are the patterns of speech. And that's all of that absorption. Maybe I'm making an excuse for why I enjoy watching Jane Austen adaptations, but all of that really helps to get your mind in the right frame.
Brilliant. I'm not going to steal your question, Annukka. I have a bad habit of doing that at times.
I'm usually like quiet all the time, so the concept of historical novels is interesting. So what guides your choice of fictional characters, and how do you determine when to take creative liberties or stick to the truth?
I think that's a brilliant question, and it's a really hard balance. And I think I'm lucky probably in that I have to make the decision less than, because specifically I choose to write about women, very often they are under recorded. So I am more often fictionalizing them than not. And so in a way, I feel that sort of, I suppose I abdicate responsibility for the decision in that way. But it's a really important question, I think, because I think that interestingly, I think that the way that characters are treated in fiction can actually affect perceptions of them. And the example I always kind of go back to, maybe, is the Hilary Mantel books about Thomas Cromwell. And I find them quite a difficult read, because she shows him in all his three-dimensional reality that she has created for him based on her research. But I think also she likes him, and she excuses some things or I think you do come to like your characters. And I think that you have to be a little bit careful. And often if I'm speaking about the book, I do say this is fiction and this isn't fiction. And often in preparing for those events, I'm ready for someone to challenge what I've done. So for example, Marissa Hatesman, who's one half of the author Ambrose Parry, which is a married couple, she's an anesthesiologist. So she knew about Knox, the anatomist who buys the bodies of Birkenhead. It's all about body snatching and sale for medical teaching. She said that was quite, in a way, it was maybe a little bit challenging for her to read about someone who was presented very differently in my book. And I was saying I probably pushed him to be worse than he was, but he was pretty awful. I try not to spin people completely and to invent things that they've done that are not in line with their characters.
And you do here in this book at the end, you actually explain which characters are fictional and which aren't, which I found really helpful in one sense to sort of read that after I read the book to sort of, okay, right, okay, what was maybe true, what wasn't maybe true. And that I found was really, really helpful.
I think sorry, I was going to, if it's all right, just to say, I think it's also important that we recognize that we always bring anachronistic takes to things. We are people of our time and they were people of their time. And I become quite cross when people co-opt people in the past and say, I think they would have thought the same way as me about this. And I think I'm very happy to say, this is all my thoughts wrapped around some real events. And I think we should take ownership of that, because people in the past, I know, actually, I showed you this book. Most of the women in this book, if I met them, I couldn't speak to them. They're speaking languages I couldn't speak. We can't imagine that, we can't imagine that we understand them. We can only do our best to try.
We're going to get a good segue soon to languages. But before we go to languages, just one quick question. When you talked about characters and not liking them or liking them, and just suddenly dawned on me, have you ever fallen out of love with one of the characters you've written?
Yes. I have very much fallen out of love with a character I've just written. I sent a manuscript to my editor on Friday last week, and I've never been so happy to see the back of a person. But we'll maybe talk about that later on.
Yeah. So you've had this brilliant segue talking about languages. So you are, and I have learned that it's not pronounced Gaelic, but it's pronounced Gaelic, which obviously most of us think about suddenly very scared that we're going to sound like we're having garlic bread, but no. You are a speaker of Gaelic.
Yes.
Not many people, I think I looked this up, there was about 2,000 in Edinburgh that can speak Gaelic.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many in Edinburgh. It's about 60,000 altogether, I think.
Yeah. I think actually it might have been the census I looked at and who had put it down as their first language. Sorry, my mistake there. But how did this all become, that you speak Gaelic? And can you explain for our Finnish listeners and possibly viewers on YouTube who don't know what this language is, what it is, please?
So Gaelic is a Celtic language. There are only, I think I'm correct, there are only 6 of them left. There is Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. Now, Cornish did technically have no speakers at one point, but it has been revived, although it's still very, very small. And they are what we call P-Celtic languages. So they are all, to some degree, mutually comprehensible. And then the other branch of the Celtic language family surviving today is the Q Celtic branch, it's called, and that's Scottish Gaelic, Irish, which some people call Gaelic, but it's officially it is the Irish language, and Manx, which again is a tiny language in the Isle of Man. And again, those three speakers of those three can understand each other to a degree. I can speak a bit of Irish. And they're the only survivors. And once upon a time, the Celts ranged across a large swathe of Europe, and have a fascinating history. But those are the only languages left. They're among the smaller languages in Europe. Not the smallest, but the smaller languages. They underwent very, very serious decline in particularly the 18th and 19th centuries. So once upon a time, Gaelic was the language of Scotland. And before that, it was an incoming language. It came in sort of in, I suppose it was around the 4th, 5th century that it came to Scotland from Ireland. And once it did spread through the whole country, except Orkney and Shetland up in the north, where, of course, the heritage is Scandinavian. And it was spoken very widely, but gradually retreated to the Highlands and Islands, where really its heartlands are today. But there's been lots and lots of efforts to revive it. And I've done some lovely jobs and other things in my time. I said earlier, I was a publisher, and I published in Gaelic, both educational resources and also published children's books as a volunteer. Myself and 3 friends, we published, I think, 22 books over a 4-year period as volunteers. It was a mad project, but we had all sorts of fun, and we just wanted children to have books to read, because there aren't enough books. There's not enough. The broadcasting, I've done lots and lots of bits of Gaelic broadcasting in my time, but there isn't enough money. Like all minority languages, not nearly as much money has been spent on preserving them as has been spent in history on stamping them out. So it's quite a challenge. But I hope people are starting to realise that intangible heritage, as we might call it, is really precious. There's a wonderful writer in Scotland called Alexander McCall Smith, and he says that the death of a language is like the silencing of a bird. It's hitting the same. It's about diversity of thought and perspective and memory and different views on the world. It's as though we would only imagine one language. It would be like having one variety of rice. How vulnerable our food supplies would be, how vulnerable our thoughts would be. It's so important that people have their own identities, I believe, and their own languages and cultures. And of course, in your part of the world, there are languages like Sami that are fabulous cultural heritage troves, I believe, and I hope they'll survive. And I hope I've done a bit for Gaelic, and I can continue to do so. Will I say something?
Sorry?
Should I say something in Gaelic?
Yes, please.
Please.
So if I was going to introduce myself, I suppose I would say Smisha Madi. Ha mi fuioch show on the Dunedin on an Halapu. Agus marahir show a clinging there, show Gaelic na Halapu, show Kudisha Haikultach.
Ooh.
Probably the only Gaelic on your podcast plan.
Yeah.
It will be, definitely. Brilliant. We could talk forever and ever, but we're going to go back to the books now, because I'm going to ask you for tips and hints, takeaways for the listener, what you could sort of help them with. And I think, Annukka, actually, you got a question here for the tips and hints.
Yes,
I'm just very, very worried about stealing her questions.
No, don't be, please. Many people dream of writing a novel, but making the dream come true can feel difficult. What advice would you give to someone just starting out, saying, I want to write a novel?
So the first piece of advice I'd give is don't think in terms of a novel at first. I like to use the analogy of a couch to 5K run. I wouldn't say tomorrow, if I wanted to become a runner, it wouldn't, I mean, some people I know would say I want to run a marathon, but there would be lots of stages on the road to doing that. And the first thing to do is to have fun with writing and experiment with writing and find the sort of things you like writing. And I think short form writing is a really good way to start. So that's, if you like, your couch to 5K, do your short form. And then that kind of lets you find your voice. So I showed you, We Are All Witches. I'm going to show you it the right way up even. We Are All Witches. They're short fictions, and actually it lets you really experiment with, as I say, voice. Also for that, it let me write something very intense that would have been difficult to sustain for me, as well as maybe for the reader. So start short, practice. And then something that I'm going to recommend specifically is play about with dialogue. I came to writing partly through writing for stage and for television. They were maybe the first sustained things or maybe the first things I should say that I wrote professionally. And those dialogue is at the heart of everything. It's at the heart of the idea of voice. And I think that writing conversations, writing exchanges, writing speech is a really brilliant way of sort of exercising your writing muscles. And that can then take you into writing all sorts of first person point of view kind of work. And I think those would be my big tips. And can I add a tip that's not about writing creatively? One of the things I find fascinating is the different ways that men and women use language. And I used to write with a writing partner when I wrote TV, and he often wrote the men and I wrote the women, because the way that we speak is very different. And he learned tricks from me and I learned tricks from him. And sometimes I think it's important for women to think about ways that you to just make sure that you're not being apologetic about your place in the world. My dad, as I said, I was lucky. I am lucky. My parents are people who've always kind of supported us and advised us. And my dad's fascinated by language. Every birthday, every Christmas, I can just buy him lots of books about language. And he gave me some brilliant tips. You don't apologize for yourself. Don't start a sentence by saying, "I'm sorry, but." No is a complete sentence. You can just say no, and you don't have to justify yourself. And this is a top tip that I've used all of my life. Don't tell people how you feel. Tell them what you think, because your feelings can be so easily dismissed, because feelings aren't always rational, they aren't always correct, but your opinions and what you consider and what you think. And so in some ways, I know that's a bit of a spiral round, but writing women's voices gives me a lot about how women can power up using their voices and using their words. And in a way, I suppose often when I'm writing about people who are not doing that. And I'm often writing about women who are not allowed to speak, and we are allowed to speak. So let's speak with confidence and authority, because we have the right to, we have earned it.
Both me and Annukka, we're here in tandem, clapping there.
I'm doing my soapbox now. I'll get off my soapbox.
No. You're welcome to be on your soapbox about this, because it's important. And like you said, this, we have a tendency of saying "I feel," and then women get blamed for being emotional. But we feed that by saying "I feel" rather than saying "I think this is wrong" or "I think you're making a mistake." If I was like, "I feel you're making a mistake. I feel like we should do this." Oh, emotional. So
And sometimes we even need the confidence when someone says something. We tend, and I think we're educated to say, "I feel that's unfair." And it's very hard to learn, but sometimes it's important to say, "That's unfair." And we don't even qualify it, but we're just taught, they say, don't they, that in a meeting, a man and a woman who say the same thing, the woman will be considered aggressive. Yeah. And sometimes I think in my professional life I have been challenged by men who've said I'm aggressive, and I said I've often said I think you'll find I'm assertive, and it's quite a pejorative way to describe someone.
I was actually going to ask you about any sort of particular challenges as an author that you've sort of had to face.
I think I've been quite lucky in the sense that I've had such kind support from so many people. And I hope when I was a publisher that I was kind to authors and to readers. But I think generally it is a very difficult industry. it pays very, very unfairly. Authors promote their own work in the publishing trade, as it were. We promote our own work for free. So I'm conscious that I'm able to do some things that potentially someone who, if your day job doesn't pay enough and you're working a second day job to support, say, 2 children, and you've got those childcare responsibilities, you're not going to be able to say, well, I need to use my holiday to go on tour. So, I know that there's levels that I'm lucky in that sense that I earn enough in my day job that I'm able to be part-time and combine that with writing. But I think one feels vulnerable. And in the sense that I always feel, it's scary to me in a way, Dorita, seeing you with the book, because you want people to enjoy your work. And so you're putting yourself out there. It can be quite exposing in that way. But as I say, I think mainly I have only ever had kind support. So I should say I'm very lucky.
Brilliant. And what's happening next in your life? So you talked about a new book.
Yes. So I think I'm not allowed, unfortunately, to tell you precisely what the new book is about, but I can tell you that it's about a well-known writer of an earlier period, the same sort of period as the Specimens, who spent some time in Scotland and left Scotland and wrote an iconic work of world literature. And while she was in Scotland, she had a very, very close friendship with a girl of the same age. And at the end of their very close friendship, she wrote this iconic work, but they both made choices in their relationships, about relationships, that are very questionable, not just to our eyes, but even at the time were very, very, very questionable. And so I'm sort of exploring the dynamics of their friendship and the dynamics of their broader group. They're part of, the writer is part of a broader, very, very famous group. And looking at ways that, again, women's stories can be co-opted and used in the service of others, especially women who are voiceless for whatever reason. But it's been a complicated write. The group is very, very evidenced. So there are mountains of things to read. There are thousands of letters. There are hundreds of biographies. But this is a very special period where there's nothing. And actually, this woman's writings, when she was young, her juvenilia, were all destroyed or lost. And I have woven that in. So in my telling, that's not an accident in any way, shape or form. So I've been working on that, and I'm very happy to have sent it to the poor editor now has to plough her way through these people. And then I actually, really strangely, it went away, and I said to my husband, I'm so relieved because I've been working really hard and I can maybe have fun, and I collect and decorate and like mostly antique dolls' houses and miniatures, and so I could do some of that and have fun. And now I've got an idea for another book that I'm desperate to write, and so I've started writing it like an idiot.
So you've just only handed that in, and now you're starting to with another project.
Yes.
Oh,
and
wow.
something I didn't say to you is I have a lot of the time when I'm writing, I know this sounds a little bit, I worry it sounds a bit pretentious, but a lot of the time the writing resolves in my mind at night, either if I'm not asleep at night or actually in my sleep. I think about it in the day, and then somehow I process it in my sleep. Sometimes it's in nightmares when I'm working on something very dark. And so now I'm waking up in the night and wanting to scribble everything down, because I think it's all just processing, and I'm so excited to write the new thing. So maybe that's just being an inveterate writer. I'm going to show you my gloves. I don't know if you can see them on screen, but they say feminist. Is that way up?
Excellent. Oh, wow. And when will this new book, not the one that you just started writing, but the one you handed in, so when would that be out?
September. The specimens will come out in the summer in paperback.
Mm-hmm.
The new book will probably be the end of September.
Brilliant.
So another busy year.
Another busy year. Thank you very much, Mairi, for coming on to Sisu Sisters podcast and talking to two Finnish women about your career and your books, how to become an author, how you became an author, sharing your tips and hints. And we were thrilled to have you as a guest. Thank you.
May
Thank you
I
so
call
much.
myself a Sisu sister now?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, you can.
Thank you so
You
much.
can be the Edinburgh branch of the Sisu
Yes.
Sisters.
And that's an honor for us also.
I'm so proud. Thank you. So I've enjoyed speaking to you so much, and I'm so delighted you invited me.
That was author Mairi Kidd. What an infectious and lovely lady. We could have listened to her for another hour, probably.
Yes, and I have to read her books. I just realized I have to.
Well, you can borrow mine.
Yeah.
Very, very inspiring, and I felt that her tips and hints, the takeaways were really good. Which ones did you like in particular, Annukka?
The one that's actually related to LinkedIn, to writing posts. So to how to write a book and how to write posts. You just have to start.
Yeah. And that you don't have to write long form immediately.
Yep.
Start short.
True. Yeah.
And it obviously resonated with me and probably with you as well when she said about don't be apologetic.
Yes.
Don't say I feel, say I think.
I think this was a good one.
I think so too. Okay, so that's all from us. Where can people find you, Annukka, if they want to look you up?
They can find me on LinkedIn and on Instagram and on my website. Where can they find you, Dorita?
Right, so I'm as well on LinkedIn, Dorita Dahl-Foreman. I'm on Instagram, English with Dorita. And we, obviously you and me, we have the sisusisterspodcast.com website where you can find all the episodes that you might have missed out on.
Yes.
But that was all from us. I'm just going to say thank you and over and out from England. Bye.
And it's goodbye from Jyväskylä, Finland. Bye.